The insurgency that drove the War of Independence in the 1770s was strongly rooted in Boston. It was a reaction by colonists to the hard lines of British rule, but it also follows a tradition of self-rule and religious dissent of the Puritan meeting house. The most famous example is Boston's Old South Meeting House, where history can be seen in a very different light, thanks to a multi-channel video installation called When Up, Look Down. The project is a collaboration between the site's managing group, Revolutionary Spaces, and the public art nonprofit Now and There. To tell us about the installation are its creator, Darren Cole, and the CEO of Revolutionary Spaces, Nathaniel Sheidley. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Now, first of all, tell me a little bit more about the setting. A lot of people in Boston know this story already because the Old South Meeting House is often linked with the Boston Tea Party, but how important a place was this in the social fabric at the time?
Yeah, it was at the center of the sense of community that many people in Boston had at the time. So we think of the meeting house for the role that it played in the political protests of the time period. But most people knew it as a place of worship and as a place that their families came to be together, place where community members met one another weekly or more frequently. And it defined the sense of purpose and values that many community members held.
Well, this is a time when racial exclusion, or at least some kind of segregation, was pretty much the norm in the British colonies. What about this particular meeting house? What was the practice at the time?
Yeah, I mean, the experience of life in Boston during the 1760s and 1770s was an experience of living in a fairly steep social hierarchy, and that hierarchy was mapped onto the meeting house floor. So you knew where you fit in the hierarchy by where you sat. You know, the wealthiest residents of Boston, the wealthiest members of the congregation sat in the front row of pews on the ground floor. And at the very top in the second balcony, enslaved members of the community in Boston had their seats for worship. And so, you know, one had only to look around to understand where one fit into the established hierarchy.
Darren Cole, even those of us who grew up in Boston, we didn't have this kind of detail on our historical maps, at least not most of us. What does that have to do with the mission of your project here?
I think for me, it's just continuing on that hard work and sort of that like lineage of what it means to even think critically about being an American. I mean, I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. My grandmother actually picked cotton. She's 99 years old this year. So when I think about very similar to what Nat's speaking on, like place, space, where I'm supposed to be, where I am right now, and how I'm able to use something that I've only heard about in reflection to my like creative aspirations, to me is really powerful. So I think that I really just want people to be able to see that there are layers and like a history that goes much further than just a beautiful building or a place that might have a surface level history. But if you actually take the time to look up, you might ask, oh, who sat there? What was going on up there? Because there is space for all of these imaginations.
What's foremost in your mind, looking up from below or looking down from above?
I think I got the idea from another creative artist turned filmmaker, Tony Hill. He has a piece called Downside Up, where you're actually just using a structure to actually answer other questions. And that's what I wanted to do. It's like when up, look down can actually sound like really intimidating, like, oh, I have the power or I have the advantage. But in some ways, it makes me question, why would I want to do that in the first place? So in this way, I'm asking people when they're up to look down to actually start to dig further for the truths that are there.
Yeah. Now, one of the other aims here with this installation is to have people think maybe more vividly about what it was like to live in this time with this sort of a context of people around you. What would that mean?
Well, in this work, what we actually did is we involved a live camera feed that will actually take an interactive approach of bringing the audience into the space and seeing what they look like as a part of the work. So as they're being filmed, they're actually becoming a historical representation of what was in that space and then what is actually in this space right now. And that will be actually, juxtaposed with my own imagination of what people could be doing in this space at the same exact time. Those that might not look like the everyday visitors of the Old South Meeting House.
Turning back to Ned Sheidley, how is this installation going to work after it's unveiled? And for people who just would be casually going along the Freedom Trail, maybe, what are they going to encounter?
They'll discover this installation when they come into Old South Meeting House, and it will be. I mean, what I'm excited about is it's going to be an invitation for people to really think differently and more deeply about what the history of the space might have been, but also to understand how they fit into that history, because this building is a place where some of our basic questions about how democracy works took shape. We haven't finished wrestling with those questions, and Darren's work is an invitation for people to think deeply about how they fit into that story.
Speaking of the story, Nat, what about what this meeting house meant for the Black community in Boston? Because if they're living in different houses and probably not having much contact with each other, here they are coming together in the meeting house. Did they sort of capitalize on that in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a place like Old South is one of the few gathering places where the community of those who were enslaved in Boston during the 18th century could come together, could recognize themselves as having common experiences and a shared sense of purpose about the change they were striving to make in the world around them. So we can see as folks encounter Darren's piece, it may invite them to ask what it would have been like to be up on that second balcony, and how the experience of looking down from up there might have shaped their sense of purpose and their goal of making change. And I hope that visitors can also understand that it can be an inspiration for us today as we think about continuing that tradition of making change in the world and always pushing for a more just and equitable future.
Darren, in Boston, the Freedom Trail idiom is full of all of these words like freedom, equality. And then you walk into this building and you see this installation, you're thinking, oh, wait a minute. What does that say to your mind?
I think for me, it's just that space where everyone should feel welcome. And that's why we have the camera there to invite them to start to create and change this past. And I think Nat hit it on it perfectly when he said, there's like a diversity of voices and faces here in Boston. And we want to invite them into this space as well and have them feel empowered that their voices are being represented in a space where they might have only come here once when they were in kindergarten or at a young age and might not have understood why they were being told about a certain history that might not have reflected them. But in this moment, they can say, wait a minute, there is a way for me to learn from this moment. And I'm seeing other artists that look like me represented in this space. And that's what I'm actually most excited about, being a 2021 fellow with Revolutionary Spaces.
One other thing, Darren, too, is I know we talk about, when there was slavery in Massachusetts, we're talking about this as a deficit, as a hardship. But there was a Black community that had leadership that was actually struggling to make things better. And that too got overlooked. So isn't this project one more way of shedding light on that, maybe?
I think you've hit it right on the head. I mean, my grandmother that I was speaking about later ran the NCAACP in her neighborhood in Benton Harbor, Michigan. So, and she actually went on to own her own cleaning laundromat as well, so that she was able to actually have a dry cleaners that she owned and then empowered other people. So being able to see that full spectrum over 100 years just leads me to say, hey, can I be in that same space to make change for the next person that happens to come on the Freedom Trail and then see this and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm actually a part of this history as well.
Yeah. Nat Sheidley, what about the other aim here? Because even beyond talking about a particular part of the history in Boston, you're also trying to engage more people, whether they're from here or somewhere else. Do you see the project working in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think works of art like Darren's are a fantastic way to interest people who might not realize what there is to explore in a building like this. It makes the stories that live in the building come to life, but it also challenges us to interface with them in a different way. I mean, I think one of the wonderful things about art, and one of the reasons we're experimenting with these kinds of installations, is because there's a common experience that we all have of trying to make meaning around the intervention, the disruption that artists like Darren put in front of us. We all have to struggle to make meaning from that. And in that common experience is an opportunity to come together, to hear each other, and to think anew about the world that we live in.
By the way, one last detail, Nat Sheidley, if people want some more information about when the installation will be ready, or any other details about what's going on at your sites, is there some place they can find that online?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is to go straight to our website, which is www.revolutionaryspaces.org. And it's very easy to find your way to information about this installation right there.